Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint, Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Orla and I'm delighted to be joined by Hilton Giesenow, MVP ChitChattr South Africa, who'll be talking to you today all about Viva Connections. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC21. Don't forget to check out the Resource Centre. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. A big thank you to our Webinar Teams Week supporter, Veeam, who sponsors this webinar today. It's great to have their support for this exciting week. You have the chance to win one of two €100 Amazon vouchers from Veeam. You can win by submitting your raffle registration on the page showed on the screen or just scan the QR code. There'll be two winners. One winner will be selected randomly from the list of people attending Veeam's webinar, 8 Microsoft Team Backup Facts You Need to Know, this Thursday, and the second winner will be randomly selected from the entire list of Veeam's raffle registrants. Don't miss your chance to win. Winners will be randomly selected next week and contacted via email. The European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community Conference returns November 28th to the 1st of December 2022 in Copenhagen. Our exclusive 2-for-1 sale on 4-day tickets is now on for 1 day only, the 7th of December 2021. Act now to get your tickets. Continue your Teams learning by joining us tomorrow, Wednesday, December 8th, 2021, for a webinar with Visa Nopanen about Microsoft Loop and how to loop in your team for fluid collaboration. Full details, check out sharepointeurope.com/your guide to Microsoft Teams. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of this presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it's available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Hilton Giesenow. Just a moment.
There we go. Hi, everybody.
Hello, Hilton.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thanks.
All right, perfect. So let's turn on the screen sharing as well. Or are we seeing the right screen?
Yep, all good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good day, whatever time it is. Obviously, in your region, I'm very excited today to talk to you about several of my favorite topics actually coming together under the Viva Connections brand. So without any further ado, let's jump into the slides. The first thing I'm going to do, just so that we all get to know each other in at least one direction. I'd love to get to know you other ways, but you can reach out to me on the connection details on the bottom right there. But a little bit about me: I've been in the industry for several decades across various technologies, primarily in the Microsoft space. I've been a Microsoft MVP for 12 times. So obviously that predates Teams. A lot of that was in the SharePoint space specifically, and moving into Teams more recently. So these are many of my favorite technologies on the Microsoft side. In terms of work, I am, as Orla mentioned, I'm the founder of ChitChattr.com, which is a startup focused on building apps for Microsoft Teams. So if you go ahead and check out our website, you'll see some of the things that we built. One of our apps is in the top like 1% of apps in the Microsoft Teams store, something along those lines. Aside from that, and in addition to that, and predating that, I'm also one of the founders of a consultancy called Experts Inside, and we focus primarily in the EMEA region, Europe and Middle East and Africa region. So you may have encountered us or some of my other colleagues over time as well. Like I said, on the bottom right, there are contact details, so I'd love to get in touch if you have any other questions or things you'd like to find out about from the webinar today, anything like that, please feel free to get in touch. In terms of agenda, though, let's move into what we actually wanted to focus on. The reason you came wasn't to hear about me, but to hear about Viva Connections. What are we going to be talking about today? I find it's always useful, especially not knowing where everybody's background is and their knowledge and experience with the technologies, to touch a tiny little bit on the background of how we got to where we are with Viva Connections, and also understanding that Viva Connections is part of the Viva family, a broader set of tools. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I just want to make sure everybody's kind of up to speed and all on the same page. What we'll do after that is we'll focus on what Viva Connections is. So we'll actually have a few minutes just looking at what makes up Viva Connections. It's a little bit more complicated than it might seem. It's a bit of a strange term at this point in terms of what it encompasses and doesn't encompass. So we'll chat about that a little bit and look at some of the features in action. After that, what we'll look at is how to get up and running with Viva Connections in your organization. And I've called it there dialing up because we'll see that it's not simply about turning it on or off. You can actually choose which pieces you'd like and potentially what order you'd like to roll those out in your organization. So I've used the idea there of kind of dialing up, like dialing up the volume to suit where you are, and we'll talk about that later. I will show you one or two more interesting and unsupported, or interesting and shall we call them more advanced scenarios. I'm not sure whether they're supported or not. We're not breaking anything specifically, but it's some other things that may be of interest or use in your organization, which may or may not be fully supported, but we'll touch on those a little bit later. We'll also look at customization though. Viva Connections has a lot of out-of-box capabilities, but there is some option to customize and enhance and extend it as well, which we'll touch on a little bit as well. So this isn't particularly a business session or an IT session or a developer session or anything like that. We often, try and categorize webinars like this into one of those. This is really a little bit of all of these, trying to get you up to speed depending on where you are and what role you play in the organization. So without further ado, let's jump into actual Viva Connections. And what I find interesting is that when Connections was first announced, and to a large extent, it really is kind of a combination of Microsoft SharePoint and Microsoft Teams. When it was first announced around that time, somebody asked me a question. They said, "Oh, isn't this just Teams and SharePoint?" And I said to them, in some ways it is, but that's really not the right way to look at it. What you should be saying is, wow, this is Teams and SharePoint together. If you want to take the analogy, it's like peanut butter and jelly. Two of the most important, most influential, and most critical technologies in the Microsoft stack coming together in a really beneficial way. So Connections for me is an extremely exciting combination of a lot of my favorite passions anyway, but enabling a lot of new scenarios and a lot of new capabilities in the organization as well. And what we've seen is, of course, over the last 2 years, is that these kind of capabilities and the ability to be in touch and to make connections across the organization have become more critical than ever. We're all fully aware of what's happened across the world with COVID the last little while, but not necessarily aware of what that means from an implication of tools and technologies landscape. I spoke with a client about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I asked them where they were with Teams, somebody I hadn't spoken to for a long time, and they said to me, well, you know what, we're not really focusing on Teams anymore because we're all going back to the office soon. And that was very sad for me to hear, because what it meant was, in their mind, Teams was still primarily a communications tool, a voice and video and screen sharing tool. And that meant they'd left untapped a huge amount of the capability of Teams for collaboration, productivity, and connectivity, aside from just communication. However, while Viva Connections, or the Viva family and Viva Connections, was only announced earlier this year, the foundations of what make up and what led to the Viva family and Viva Connections as our topic today really go back quite far. We see several years ago Microsoft starting to get into modern SharePoint, finally updating and modernizing the UI. If you're on premises in SharePoint 2016 or 2013, I still know several clients on 2013. The UI is very much very much dated, and even in 2016, for example, we saw no major updates from a UI perspective. So around that year, aside from the SharePoint 2016 on-premises version, around that year we see Microsoft starting to modernize and enhance the UI and capabilities of the product itself, and we see communication sites starting to come in 2019. We start to see integration between Yammer and Stream and so on. We also see, interestingly, something called the SharePoint Home Sites app announced, which is no longer a thing on itself. This is effectively what became Viva Connections. In 2020, interestingly, we also start to see integration between Teams and Yammer. So various communication and collaboration platforms in the Microsoft space starting to come together, and Connections extends that as well. What we see coming in the Microsoft space extensively in the Connections timeframe is this focus from Microsoft on something called the employee experience, where Microsoft is effectively starting to say we're as a company providing the tool sets as we've always done, but we're starting to provide an emphasis on those tool sets on enabling and enhancing the experience of employees in our organization, which has never been as important as it is today. I'm going to turn off the webcam, by the way. I think you don't all necessarily need to see me. Let's focus more on the content. If that's a problem, let me know. But as I said, that effectively is the lead in from Microsoft into Microsoft Viva Connections. So that's the story of kind of how SharePoint and Teams and Yammer and so on came together to form the Connections piece of Viva. As I mentioned, though, I'm not going to spend much time on these, but as I mentioned, if you're not aware, Viva is a collection of Microsoft products under a particular brand. So Connections is one of the 4 apps in the suite, but there are 3 others as well, and they all provide tremendous capability. Here's a very mini screenshot of each one of them. So you'll see insights focusing on productivity and well-being, understanding how effective you're being at work, for example, Viva Topics focusing on knowledge management and knowledge exploration and so on, and Viva Learning helping to provide an experience around learning and development and so on in the organization, various third-party plugins and providers and so on. Again, I'm not going to focus on these, but important to understand that Connections is just one part of the overall Viva family, which currently has 4 products, and the announcement that a 5th one may be joining the stable soon. Now, when I'm talking about SharePoint and Teams in the context of Viva Connections, what does that mean? We've been able for a long time to combine SharePoint and Teams together. This is just an arbitrary example, but it's something I'm working on with a customer at the moment, a small project to embed or to provide a capability for some kind of line of business application, which is being built as an SPFX solution. So it's a SharePoint framework solution that, in addition to hosting in SharePoint and providing in SharePoint, we're embedding in a Teams experience as well. So we're effectively combining, and what you're seeing here is the SharePoint content hosted inside of Teams. And again, this is just a one particular unrelated example. But does this mean that we're doing Viva Connections? And this is a question that kind of comes in various ways. How do we understand what Viva Connections is when we're talking about combining SharePoint and Teams and other things as well? So what I think that is useful, and the last thing we'll look at before we actually dive into Connections itself, looking at what it can do. The last thing I wanted to leave you with is just a thought of understanding where Connections plays in. And I'm sure many of you over time have seen the kind of content pyramid that we refer to as, which is kind of understanding where the organizational content lives and what the experience is around that content. So typically we have, for example, at the top, primary organizational content typically presented in an intranet. So this would be things that everybody needs to have access to, like policies and procedures and leave systems and so on. But that's very controlled content. As we move down, we have collaborative team style content, and finally personal kind of content over time. And traditionally, these would have been, for example, SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive, if you want to think about particular technologies. But when we're talking about Connections, what's important is the previous thing that I showed you would kind of fit more in the middle. What Connections is encompassing is it is the combination of SharePoint, Teams, Yammer, and various other things, for example, but its focus is that set of technologies in the context of a broader corporate communication and connection capability. So it's effectively that top of the pyramid. And the tools that come into play certainly are much the same. As I mentioned, SharePoint and Teams and so on. OneDrive can have a role to play in there, so can Exchange, Yammer, the Power Family, etc. It's not really about any particular technology, although Teams, SharePoint, and to some extent Yammer are the most front and center. But again, it's really around focusing on that top of the pyramid kind of capability, which is where Connections plays. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and have a look at what Microsoft Viva Connections actually is. So I'm going to jump into a demo tenant here. I've got obviously SharePoint running, as you can see, and I'm running Teams just in the browser for this tenant, just so that everything's all in one. I'm logged in as Megan, as you can see, so I have various personality challenges today, but let's bear with us as we go through. Okay, what we're seeing here is a SharePoint modern communication site. It happens to be the root site. It's not required to be. We do need to use a modern communication site, but it doesn't have to be the root site, but it is in this case just for simplicity's sake. And I have essentially, this is completely out of box. This is a new demo tenant that was provisioned with all the standard stuff provided for me. So there's a basic news publishing capability. There's even some sample news published already as part of this. And we see, you know, nice layout and design. If you're familiar with lookbook.microsoft.com, you can get a similar thing like this up and running just in minutes. Quite a nice design and experience for your users. And we have, again, in the sample tenant, some sample videos. We have, you know, Yammer embedded in here with some discussions and a, you know, Twitter feed and et cetera, et cetera. So there's kind of a nice starting point for something that could be or may already be a corporate internet or intranet in place. So this is all standard modern SharePoint. We also have the ability to implement something called global navigation more recently in SharePoint. So that means no matter where I am, any SharePoint site in the organization, I can have one standard menuing kind of experience, which will help me jump to frequent sites and followed sites and access global news and so on, as well as the ability to customize parts of this menu, like, for example, providing one high-level global nav experience across all of SharePoint. Now, all of this is included in Viva Connections. To be totally honest with you, though, all of this to a large extent predated Viva Connections. The first thing that we see that's totally new in Viva Connections is something here called the dashboard. And what this is it's an area that we can present these little mini experiences, if you like, what are called ACEs or adaptive card extensions. Essentially little cards, basically little micro experiences. There are two options for sizing, a small one like this and a larger one like this, which curiously enough, this one's called medium, that one's called large. So I don't know what small would be, but there's no actual option. But we'll see that in just a moment. But essentially, this is the what's called the dashboarding kind of experience. There are two options with the dashboard. There is a a horizontal option like this. There is a vertical capability as well. So you can embed the dashboard onto your page. When you do, notice you can't have multiple dashboards. You can only have one set of content in the dashboard, but you can present it horizontally or vertically, or in this case, which makes no sense at all, other than just for demonstration purposes, I've put both of them on the page. But again, notice that it's the same. I can't choose different things here versus here. I can simply choose where I put it on the page and whether it's horizontal or vertical. Importantly, Microsoft, although this is possible in both cases, Microsoft recommend a vertical approach rather than horizontal, and we'll see why in a few moments. Okay, now this is our company corporate intranet. It's a home site in SharePoint, whatever that means. We'll talk about that a little later, and I've configured and turned on certain things. When I enable Viva Connections, what that means is that when I switch over to Teams, and as I mentioned, we're in the browser, so we'll see everything working, but I know that probably feels a little strange. You know, we're not used to necessarily having Teams as a browser tab. It's usually a standalone experience, but just bear with me for demo purposes. But essentially, we have the SharePoint experience here, and what I've done is inside of Teams, of course, I can do whatever I need to do in Teams, but one of the apps that's installed as part of my experience as a normal user is this Viva Connections app. And what emerges in there is that SharePoint site. Again, I know it's a little silly, I can switch between the two, but if I didn't have a browser open and I was in Teams, which is a more realistic scenario, I could, through this left rail, this left menu, go ahead and access my corporate intranet experience in the Teams context. And that's our Viva Connections. Now, this is the full experience, so you'll notice all the things that we saw before, although they're loading a little slowly on my poor internet, everything's there. The Yammer conversations, the Twitter feeds, the news, etc., etc. All of that is loading fully in the experience, including these newer things that we spoke about, this dashboard experience with these little mini interfaces, these little card experiences. So I can access and do all of the kind of stuff that I may have done. One of these, for instance, is a web link card, and I've just chosen arbitrarily Microsoft.com. So I can go ahead and click on that, and that would load Microsoft. That's what that little card does. I can have all kinds of other things that the cards could be doing. One of them, for instance, is an approvals app, or an approvals card, which links to the Teams approval capability through this in the embedded experience, either in the browser if I'm choosing to go there, or in the Teams embedded experience. I can go ahead and access my approval requests, create a new one, etc. So these are just some samples of what we can do. Something to notice, though, is that the left menu is gone. We don't have this capability anymore visually accessible. However, that is part of Connections. What Microsoft's done is they've made it accessible on the actual button itself. So let's say I'm somewhere else just to see what that looks like. If I go to Viva Connections, I get the web experience. But if I click again on that button, that's how I can open and close and access that menu. And it is the same menu. Everything that I put in here is available here, but it does render a little bit differently. So notice that news, for example, there's 5 items there, whereas if I go to news here, it's a longer list. So it does represent things a little differently. If I go to sites, I'll see frequent sites and then just a single followed sites, where if I go here, I only see the followed sites. So it's pretty much conceptually the same experience, but some minor differences inside there. But that's how we can go ahead and access that that menu experience to get that menu to come up as well. And then obviously being in Teams, we're not in SharePoint. We can't we can't necessarily do everything we may want to do from a SharePoint perspective. So it gives us some additional links, like the ability to go ahead and break out to open the web page or reload it, or to link to the web page that we could send to someone an email, something like that. So this is largely what we're or what we're looking at from a Viva Connections perspective. One last little piece though that I do want to show you is there's an integration with the search experience in Teams as well. So by default, if I go ahead and just search in Teams, I will be searching Teams only content. So for instance, here's some messages that have been sent by by a bot in Teams, for example. But when I integrate Viva Connections, I also have a unified search experience, if you want to call it that way, where I have the ability to also break out into the Microsoft 365 search directly as part of this as well. So that additional option becomes available when we install Viva Connections. And I've actually branded Viva Connections to Contoso.net. So when I installed it, that's the name that I used, and it actually picks that up automatically and provides that as the additional search experience inside there. Sorry for the water break. Okay, so that is a primary overview of the Viva Connections end user experience. The process of creating this and setting it up, we'll look through the process of getting Viva Connections installed, but if we look from a SharePoint perspective, for instance, it's no different from anything else that you would have done in SharePoint. So we have, if you're familiar with creating a page or publishing a news article or anything like that, it's exactly the same. If I wanted to customize the homepage, for example, I can go ahead and add for instance, let's add some text onto the homepage. This is exactly the same as it would have been whether I was using Teams or not, whether I'm using Viva Connections or not, etc. This is the standard SharePoint, modern SharePoint content editing experience. The one key thing that's different, though, is the dashboard itself. So let's see really from a next stage perspective what that looks like, because that's something that's likely to be new. So when we have our home site configured, and I'll talk about what that means again a little bit later if that's not something that's familiar to you, but when we have our primary site configured, what's called the home site, then we have some additional capabilities that are enabled for us. One of them is that global nav, which again predates Viva Connections, but this is how you'd access it in that primary location. The new item that's available for us here, though, is something called the Setup Viva Connections link. When I click on that, what it enables me to do, to be honest, it's actually badly named. It doesn't help me set up Viva Connections. What it does do is it helps me set up and configure the dashboard for Viva Connections. So if I go ahead and click the View Dashboard button, what this does is it takes me to a dedicated page just for the dashboard. Now, you might decide to actually make this, because this is just a page, you might decide to make this available to users. You may want them to see all of the items in one giant dashboard page, for example. But if you don't, in either case, you'll come here as an administrator to go ahead and modify the dashboard. So what we can do is we can switch into edit mode, and notice that it gives me the ability to edit in either a desktop or a mobile view. So immediately I can kind of see what that's going to look like for end users as well. Obviously, I can save draft, discard changes, etc., and publish as well. So those are kind of standard from a SharePoint perspective, but obviously the ability to see the different views is important to make sure everything's going to work on mobile. And then we have a more fully featured preview experience here as well, which again gives me desktop and mobile. But when I'm in edit mode, there might be certain things like add a card, for example, that I'm seeing, and we may just want to do a little bit more testing. Now, in terms of the cards, anybody who's worked with a SharePoint page and added a web part, this will look very familiar. It's not identical because these aren't web parts; these are adaptive card extensions, ACEs. But the experience in terms of the add experience and this little chooser and so on that comes up are identical. And out of the box, we have 6 items that are available to us. These are just recent ones that I've used, but these are the 6 items that are available to us. So we have here the Approvals app, and all I've done is I've just dragged it on. I've gone ahead and selected it. Now, I can add it many times, obviously, but notice when I add it, by default, it appears a little differently. All that is just the card size. I mentioned to you that I call the small and medium, but Microsoft calls them medium and large, but nevertheless, I can go ahead and choose whether I'm wanting that to be the larger or the smaller experience. And then depending on the card, there might be other things that I can do. So with the approval request, for example, there's nothing I can do. Notice when I do choose a large card, though, more options are available because there's more space. Microsoft automatically will show the additional button if there is one to show versus just what they call the primary button. But that's really all I can do on the Approvals app. I can target it though, so I can choose who can see it depending on whether I have audiences available to me. But the Approvals app, that's basically all we can do. If we look at maybe a slightly more advanced card, and we look at, let's say, WebLink, what WebLink is it's a card that will enable me to provide some customization on how I show the link to the users, but essentially enable me to put a link on the page. So if we go ahead and choose, let's say, my favorite car company, and we go to Tesla, Tesla.com, and we decide, for instance, that that's the link that we want to provide to our users, and we can go back to the dashboard and say that's the link that I'd like to provide. As soon as I capture it, it automatically will try as best as possible to get me a title to put on the card and a description based on the website as well. Now that title doesn't match perfectly because it's Tesla at the end. It's not easy to see. So we can of course go ahead and modify these things and change the description and choose a different image and so on. Again, it's picked something up from the web page, and it usually makes some good suggestions. In this case, I'm absolutely fine with that. We can also change the icon as well. We could add our own picture, or we can just choose from one of the available icons that are there. Now, Teslas make me happy, but I don't have one, so I wish I could get one. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the happy but add smiley face, and we can see it appearing there as the icon. Again, this card we have the option to choose a big or a small view. So when I do that, obviously it just adjusts accordingly, and we can go ahead and add that card. We can move them around as well. So if you want, you can drag the cards to different locations, and obviously you can add additional cards as well. The most advanced card, there's also tasks, by the way, which will show the user's tasks, shifts if that's something you're using. You can link to a Teams app. So one of the things, for instance, that I've done is I've just linked to one of our ChitChattr apps in the store directly. If you have it installed, it will load the app for you. If you don't, it will give the user the chance to install that. So that's just using one of the other options. The most advanced card, though, is something called the Card Designer. And what this does, I mentioned that these are adaptive cards. What that does is it enables you to insert something called an adaptive cards. You can find out more about that from adaptivecards.io. If it's not familiar to you, it is a technology from Microsoft that they use quite extensively in certain places in Teams and Exchange or in Outlook and so on. But what it does essentially is it gives you the ability to create rich mini interactive experiences. So I've just gone here to samples. You can see some different samples of what an adaptive card could be. Here's one with a bit of a form. Here's a restaurant example. Again, apologies for the slow internet. But here's where's a nice one? There's a flight itinerary, for example, which is quite a nice card. So it's some visual elements to that, and it's a way to kind of provide a small interactive user interface. Sometimes it's static. This one's just showing things, but it can also have buttons and interactions and so on. I think the food order is one that maybe shows that nicely. So you can do things and actually place an order and so on. Again, this doesn't do anything. This isn't a system. This is just a mock-up of what that card experience could look like. If we go ahead and just copy that food card as an example, I'm going to go ahead and use that in this experience. So the first thing we can do is change the card content. And the second thing we can do is change what's called the quick view, which is what happens when they click on a button. So if we change the card content, I won't bother with heading and so on, but let's have a primary button. And we can either have it open a web link, in which case it's kind of the same as a web one. So what I'll do is I'll say show a quick view, and they click on there. I can paste that adaptive card in, and that should be it. I think we're good to go. Let's go ahead and click on that card and see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and click preview just to see that working, and we'll go down here, we'll click on there, and there we see the food order appearing. Again, this OK button won't do anything. I haven't plugged anything behind the scenes, any system that's ready to answer that call, but that might be necessary. It might not, depends on what you're trying to do with your card. But that's certainly a much richer experience than simply opening a web page. Now, all of these, again, are just out-of-box experiences, as you can see. It's also possible to get third-party cards, and it's possible to develop your own as well, which we'll talk about later on. Okay, if I go ahead and publish that, what I'm doing is I'm saying I'm making changes to the formal dashboard, the primary dashboard for my organization. If I go back to the site, then all of those changes that that we published should appear. I might just need a refresh. Let's see why some things don't seem to be appearing. Again, could just be bad internet. Let's see what's going on here. I'll go back to the card dashboard. Let's just see if everything's fine here. Okay, everything looks fine. I'm not sure why the new cards are not appearing. Let's try that once or twice more. There we go. Okay, sometimes there's just a delay, and sometimes there's some caching or caching, depending on how you pronounce it, refresh issues. So that's in the web. If I go back to the actual Teams embedded experience, once again, I should be seeing the same things appearing there as well. My adaptive card seems to have disappeared. I'm not sure why. Something may have gone wrong in the saves. But basically, there's the new card that we added. One of the new cards that we added, and as expected, this will take me to the page. Now, one thing to note, by the way, is remember I mentioned to you that I've added the dashboard capability in two places. Now I've added that already, obviously, as you can see, but it's a very simple process to do that if you don't have it up and running. All you do is you go ahead and add a web part like you would any other web part on the main page, and the one that you want to choose here is the dashboard for Viva Connections web part. And as soon as I do that, it'll go ahead and drop the dashboard into the page. Simple as that. What I mentioned earlier, though, is that it's possible to drop it into a horizontal or a vertical configuration. But importantly, notice that when I drop it into a horizontal area, it doesn't provide a scroll experience like this, for example, above, which is certainly what I initially expected. And I don't know which is right or wrong. Personally, I'd like to see an option from Microsoft. But what it does is it just starts to expand and take up more room. So in this case, for instance, it looks quite silly. What I could do is make one of these smaller if I really needed to show these 5 cards, but just be aware if you go with a horizontal view that there can be some impacts on that. If we go ahead and click see all, by the way, then it will load up the dashboard page that we saw before that users can access to see all of the cards there. Now, in this case, we're seeing the adaptive card. Not sure why we didn't before. Again, maybe just a caching thing. Okay, so back to the slides. That was a super quick overview of everything that's included in Viva Connections. The only thing that we didn't look at, just for practicality's sake, is the mobile view. And how does that work? Viva Connections is available from a mobile perspective, not as an app on its own, like a SharePoint app versus a Teams app in the App Store, but it's part of the Teams app. So if you install the Teams app, and if you have configured the app as a user or for your users, then it will be available on the ribbon at the bottom from the mobile experience, from the Teams mobile experience. When I load that, notice that there are 3 primary experiences that are available from a mobile perspective for our users: the dashboard, the feed, and the resources. And that's effectively just what each of these 3 panels is representing here. So on the left, that's the dashboard. So what it's done is it's pulled elements out of that SharePoint homepage, if you like, and it's creating them as separate experiences here. The dashboard is showing that dashboard experience only, so it gives that full embedded experience and a good mobile experience, but just of that particular piece of the of our page, if you like. The feed is taking the primary news capabilities and making that available. So again, what it's doing effectively is it's adapting the experience to what makes sense on a mobile as opposed to a web page on a desktop kind of experience. And the last piece is the resources, which is effectively just that the menu that we would have seen in the connections experience. Now, this is something that I thought would be worthwhile to understand. And I've just taken this, you can see I'll put the link on the bottom. I've just taken this from the basic Viva Connections overview page, but I want to emphasize it to make sure that we're a little bit clear on that. The elements of Viva Connections are listed down on the left side, but it's important to know that what is our level of control as the administrators of Viva Connections in the organization. So if we look at home site, for example, which is really the SharePoint site, we can control the layout, the web part, the styling and branding. We can audience target certain content on the page or on the menu or on the dashboard, as we saw, for example, likewise with dashboard, etc. But what I wanted to really focus on is important to be aware these are curated experiences for the dashboard, the home site, and the menu and resources capability. The news feed, which is also a key part of an intranet typically and a key element in the Viva Connections life, is a tailored experience. What that effectively means is that when let's say a dashboard is curated, that means everything that's there is something you've put there, and only things that you've put there are things that users will see. From a feed perspective, Microsoft is trying to provide a useful feed to users by identifying what would be worthwhile or interesting or of importance to that user and presenting that content to them. It is possible to control that to some extent, the news that the user will see, but there is some dynamic element to it as well. So you can have a hand in it, but it's not completely curated like it is with the other components. Okay, I'm going to dive now into what's involved in the setup. I'm just checking if there's any questions. It doesn't look like there are. So if there are, just drop them into the chat and I'll try and pick them up as we go, and I'll make some time at the end as well. But what we've done so far is really look at everything that Viva Connections is and encompasses. What I want to do now is take you through what's involved in setting up Viva Connections. And this has changed very dramatically over the course of this year. There were ways to get Viva Connections experiences on the desktop, but there was a lot more manual work. There was a lot of PowerShell and so on that you needed to well, not a lot, but there was PowerShell that you needed to run, which is not necessarily something that everybody's going to be comfortable or capable of doing. A lot more of that has become a lot more turnkey and out of box as we've gone through the course of this year. However, as I mentioned right up front when I spoke about the dial, Viva Connections is not an all or nothing experience. You don't have to do everything or nothing in order to start getting into what makes sense for Viva Connections in your context, in your organization. So partly what that means is you don't have to wait, you don't have to have cards and a menu and news items and so on to start benefiting from Viva Connections. But what it also means is that you can choose where that dial should be. If you're a smaller company or you have an organizational culture that's not necessarily ready for all of the things in Viva Connections, you can go ahead and choose where you want that dial to be for your organization on a long-term or even just a short-term basis by kind of starting at one and of course increasing the dial over time. But what I want to show you is all of the pieces that are involved in Viva Connections that we've seen and what's involved in turning that dial up from 0 up till we'll actually go to 11, beyond 10 into 11 as well. So the first thing to be aware of is as a administrator of teams in the organization. So you might, if you're on the webinar, you may not necessarily fill that role, but you probably will have access to somebody who does in the organization, or you may well be that role player. The first step in getting Viva Connections is to go ahead and provide the user with the ability to install an app. And Microsoft, as I mentioned, has made that easier over time. There is at this point a Connections app in the Teams tenant administration page that you can go ahead and make enabled or even auto roll out for the users. Truth be told though, that isn't even level 1. Where I want to start with level 1 is that you have to have, if you're talking about combining or bringing a SharePoint experience into Teams, you have to have a SharePoint experience. You don't even need to use the Viva Connections app. There were ways to do something like this long before there was a Viva Connections, and those are still possible if you'd like to go that route. It's not as easy, and it's as just going with Viva Connections, but there may be reasons you want to do that, and again, we'll talk about some of those later. But again, it's level one, the most important thing. You cannot get even to level one on the dial if you don't have a SharePoint experience to bring to Teams. So there must be a SharePoint experience or SharePoint site that you want to bring to your users, and it must be a modern site as well. You can't use a SharePoint classic site for this. Now, if you have nothing, I mean, you can create a standard communication site, and that already provides a not terrible look and feel. If you have nothing at all, though, you can head over to lookbook.microsoft.com. If you're not familiar with this, it's a great resource. It's a set of beautiful templates that Microsoft provides totally free of charge to get a nice looking page for a particular purpose. These ones are landing pages, but you'll see there's department sites, or there's a new employee onboarding site, for example. There's a whole bunch of different things you might want, but typically you'll be wanting probably something like an organizational one to get you up and running. This won't write the news posts for your company, of course, but it'll give you a nice looking starting point for a site if you have nothing to get going. So as I said, that's level one on the dial. You need to have a SharePoint site to embed, and there are ways to do that if you feel like going through additional pain. The easiest way, though, to embed that and to actually get the starting point with Viva Connections itself is to enable that Viva Connections app. Now, if you are the tenant admin and you go into the admin center, you can go down to Teams apps, and you can go ahead down to the Manage Apps sections, and you can go ahead and search for Viva Connections. If I search for Viva, you'll see there are a couple of them that come up by default, but the one that we're interested in is Viva Connections. And interestingly enough, you'll see there in red status as blocked by publisher. The only app listed in this list that is listed as blocked by publisher at the moment is Viva Connections. The reason for that is because Microsoft doesn't want your users to, certain companies block all of the apps or block apps and only whitelist. We've got customers that kind of go in each direction. But if you're a company that hasn't blocked this, and users could install any app, they'd be able to install a Viva Connections app and get completely stuck. So by default, when Microsoft added this app to the store, they immediately entered it into the store in a blocked state. So if you want to make Viva Connections available, the first thing you want to do is to go ahead into that listing in the app area and go ahead and switch it from a blocked to an allowed state. It takes less than a minute, and you're done, and immediately users can go ahead and start installing the Viva Connections app into Teams. However, notice, by the way, that we're talking about the dial and dialing up the capabilities. I haven't listed this as 2, that was 2A. That still won't give them a Viva Connections experience yet. We may have a SharePoint site, and we now have the ability to install the Viva Connections app, but we need to connect those two. If the user was to install the app at that point, this is what they'd get. They'd see an app in the left menu that they'd installed, but they'd get this sad looking gentleman telling them that everything's not set up yet. To get to level 2, the next thing you have to do is you have to configure a home site in your tenant. And what's involved in that is accessing the SharePoint Admin Center. Now, depending on your organization, that might be different people that have access to the Teams versus the SharePoint Admin Center. It might be the same person, but just be aware of that. And what you're looking to do is in the SharePoint Admin Center, going to the settings area, going to the home site setting, and going ahead and choosing or specifying which site is your home site. I've done that in the screenshot, and basically what I've done is we've combined the two together, and that's all you need to do to enable your users to get a Viva Connections experience in Teams. So we have to have the site, and we allow them to have that app, and we link it via the home site. That's all you need to get the most basic experience. However, as I mentioned here, I'd installed that app explicitly by myself as a user. If you want to dial up to level 3 and you want to automatically install the app for your users, that's certainly possible as well. Again, in the Teams Admin Center, we go to Setup Policies, and we can go ahead and we create a policy. I've just called it Viva Connections here, but you can call it anything you want when you create the policy, and you can either pre-install the app just as an app in that left menu somewhere, or you can even go ahead and pin it. Like in this example, I've chosen that my app will be the first app at the top of the left menu. So both of those are possible. We create the policy, and then there's a process of applying it as well. Through the admin center, you can apply it one by one to individual users, or of course you can do that in bulk for your organization as well. You can do it in the UI, and you can do it by PowerShell, but essentially you have to apply that policy to the user or users that you want to have connections. What's useful there is that you can roll it out in stages. So you could have it as the team working on connections. You could roll it out just for you without having to go organization-wide straight away. And once you've done that, as I mentioned, for example, you can pin it automatically in the left menu for all users. Now, you'll notice that in my example, it's no longer called Viva Connections, it's called ContosoNet in my fictitious Contoso organization. If we dial up to level 4, again, not something you have to do, but easy enough to do, you can improve the experience of the connections capability for your organization. It's also possible to customize that app. We do that again in the Teams Admin Center. We go ahead and find the app, the Viva Connections app, and we can immediately start to customize it. So there's an actions menu, we click on customize, and this panel on the right opens up, and we can start to customize various things. So we can choose the name, of course, but we can also set things like a description, and if there's a privacy or terms of use URL we want to provide to users, anything like that, as well as a full description. Down on the bottom, I haven't scrolled the scroll bar, but down on the bottom there's a big icon and a small icon, just depending on what the users are seeing in what context. And it's as easy as that to change the name and the branding for the Viva Connection app. One thing to be aware of, though, we saw that list before we went and searched for Viva Connections. As soon as you customize it, it will no longer be called Viva Connections anymore. It will be called whatever you named your app. So you might get lost immediately the time after that. I would now need to go and search for ContosoNet if I wanted to make any further modifications or customizations there later. Okay, next we start to look at that global nav. Now, if you don't do any work on the global nav in the organization, simply by installing Viva Connections, the users will already have access to the sites and the news capability. If you want to provide a curated menu, you can do that, but if you don't, they will immediately get something. You need to take the next steps, again, in terms of our dial to dial up to starting to work with the global nav. The way you do that is in that primary site that you've designated as the home site. I didn't discuss that before, but when the administrator sets the site up as the home site, that's when you'll start to get some of the new menu items like Global Nav and the Viva Connections one at the bottom. What we do here is we go to Global Nav, we go ahead and enable it. I've just turned it on already in the screenshot, but we enable it. We can go ahead and choose if we want a picture and what we want to call it and so on. But then we can go ahead and set what nav items we want to appear inside there. So if you actually want to have items in that menu, like we saw in my previous example, then when you click that button to configure the global nav, the left part of the page will open up and you can start adding menu items in there. So that's all I've done here. I've just put a few items on just for demonstration purposes for today. But that's how we enabled that nav menu experience in the Teams desktop experience and how it will be enabled in the mobile experience similarly as well. Okay, if you want to start using Dashboard, just as we've seen earlier, it's possible, of course, to use it or not use it as you want. But if you want to make use of Dashboard, as I mentioned before, as soon as you configure a home site, you'll have the Viva Connections Dashboard capability available to you. Now, this is interesting. As soon as you do that, you can go ahead and put things on the dashboard, exactly what we saw before. You can add the cards and whatnot. And you can do that on this dashboard page. I mentioned I've even seen instances where companies have put dashboard on the menu. So if that's how you want to provide the dashboard to users, that's totally possible as well. But once you have a dashboard, the next stage in terms of dialing logically is to go ahead and put it onto the page, either horizontally or vertically, as we spoke about. I'm listing this as level 8 because you don't necessarily need to do this. You could provide that through through a web link or something like that. What I haven't tested is, for instance, if you turn on dashboard and you put things on there, you don't put them on the page, what would happen in the mobile experience? My inclination is the users will probably have access to it in mobile, even if it isn't actually placed on the page in the actual site. So that's why I've listed it as a separate level in our dial. And then stepping up to level 10, The next thing I wanted to speak about is news creation. If any of you have created news items in SharePoint, modern SharePoint before, it's exactly the same as before. But we spoke about that curation versus the sort of the ability to control but not fully curate the content. News creation, as I mentioned, falls into that. What is new is the ability not only to just publish a page, but to boost a page. And what we're doing here is by doing that, we have the ability to essentially encourage SharePoint to emphasize this page more. So we can turn it on or off, we can set it to a specific date, and we can choose where it goes versus the other items that are boosted. And the last thing we're going to look at here in terms of the dial 1 to 10 is audience targeting, which we haven't spoken much about. If you have existing audiences in your organization, what this does is it lets you target either cards on the dashboard or menu items on the menu, that global nav, or just news articles, for example, or just pieces on the homepage even. You can control who can see those versus who cannot. It's not security. If they had a way to access a news item or somebody emailed it to them, they could access that news item. This would just be whether it's specifically shown to them on the homepage, the news item or the card or whatever it is. We have the ability, importantly here, to target certain of the content to certain users more explicitly as it makes sense. The way we do that is something called audience targeting in SharePoint. It's something that's been in the tool for an extremely long time. As you can see from the UI, which is only a few days old, but is an extremely dated experience. Now I've created a silly audience here. I've just called it, I'm logged in as Megan, so I've just called this audience people named Megan, and I've said that how this audience is active is it's basically anybody whose first name is Megan. So really a silly example, but just to give an idea of what an audience could look like. I didn't show that to you though, because you may have audiences already. You can use them straight away. So you can go ahead and use those straight away. But unfortunately with audience targeting, if you don't have, or you're creating new audiences, you need to wait for the audience to do something called compiling. You can see that this audience is not compiled. And unfortunately, compiling takes place in SharePoint Online on a weekly basis. So you have created an audience, you need to wait up to a week for that audience to compile, which is a horrible experience, and obviously can frustrate your timelines for something like this. I suspect now that audiences are becoming more and more important in the Microsoft space, that Microsoft will look at and will work on that as it starts to gain more experience, but I have no knowledge of that. It's just my conjecture. The more people that nag, the louder the noise will get to Microsoft, and possibly the more that we will see. Okay, we're getting towards the end of time, so I'm going to just go very quickly. I just wanted to show, in case you haven't seen some of those things, this is the admin center. We looked at it in a few places, and we looked at how to access the app and so on. This is it. I showed it. It's all in the slides, which you'll have access to later. But just in case you hadn't seen it, this is the SharePoint admin center. This is where the home site would be, etc. What I do want to leave you with is dialing up to 11 and showing that, as you saw here, there are actually two Contoso apps. What I've done is I've configured an additional or alternate Viva Connections for a different user in the organization. So this is the same organization, same tenant, but for particular purposes, I've configured a different Viva Connections for this user. So it's got a different name. It's called Contoso Brand 2. It's a different page that the user is seeing. And it's going to be a different search experience that I've decided to enable as well. And the reason I've done this is just to show that if, for example, you're using, just as an example, PNP Modern Search, you may want that to be your primary search experience. It is possible to do this and provide a Viva Connections kind of experience to the users. It's not completely out of box. There's a bit more work. And I did mention up front, I'm not sure that this is fully supported. There's nothing here that breaks anything, but just be aware you're a little bit more on your own if you choose to go ahead and do this. What's involved in doing that? Well, effectively, all it is it's just a custom Teams app if we look under the hood. For anybody who's built a Teams app before, it's a zip file which contains the icons and a manifest. And all that Viva Connections is it's a specific set of settings inside the manifest. So if this is something that's useful to you, I'm happy to get in touch and explain this a little bit more detail, but just be aware this is something that's possible. This really should be a last resort. If you're wanting to turn content off for certain users, for example, that's what targeting is for. There should be very specific reasons to use something like this, but it certainly is possible. And if it's something that's interesting, we can chat more about it. Last things I wanted to leave you with, we haven't spoken about the dashboard in terms of getting other things on there. So here's two links which are interesting. This is just from a couple of weeks ago, Microsoft announcing that there are now third parties that are available in the connection space. So what I wanted to show you there was, if I just load one of those videos, this is a company that is providing a dashboard experience, for example, one of the companies that Microsoft listed on there. So this is a card that you could purchase through this company, and you can see there's certain things you can do in their pop-ups and so on. So it's exciting to see third parties starting to appear and have offerings in that space. If you want to build your own cards, though, this is a great video from Microsoft to get up and running. And again, the slides are available, so you can go ahead and have a look at that. The last thing I want to leave you with is, as I mentioned, there is another member coming to the Viva family, aside from Connections, that was recently announced. But separate to that, it's important also to be aware of pricing. Aside from Connections, the other elements in the Viva family all have some element of pricing available to them. There is some free part of learning, but there's a paid part as well. These all have a paid part. Pricing varies depending on what you want, and there's a list on the page there as well. But it's possible to get a bundle, etc., etc. But very importantly, from the perspective of our webinar, Connections is a totally free capability that's available. There's no additional charge from Microsoft to get the connection experience up and running. Okay, that's pretty much all I wanted to leave you with. Just a quick overview. That's what we looked at today, and contact details. I'm going to check over if there's any questions. I know I ran a little bit over time. Well, over time for questions, but under time for the webinar. But let's wrap up. I just want to take a
Thanks
chance
so
to say
much.
thank you. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Thanks.
And if you've got any other questions or anything, please feel free to get in touch.
Thanks a million, Hilton. There's a couple of questions here in the question box. So is Viva Connections available in different languages?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I didn't have a chance to get into that. It's not something, I'll be honest, it's not something I've played around with much. I've actually got a client project that we need to look into that for, because they're a multi-language client that we're looking at connections with. So I can't tell you a huge amount about what that does right now, but there is some multi-language capability in it. I just can't give you a huge amount of information right now. That's a great question.
Okay. Is there a limit on how many apps you can have?
So I'm not sure what the context is in that. I'd like to know, maybe from if whoever asked that, if they can expand on that. Do you mean apps in Teams or cards on the dashboard?
I think it might have come in when you were talking about the navigation, possibly.
Okay, yeah, so that's another option. Yes, so there certainly is a limit. At some point, Microsoft, you can have as many apps as you want, but at some point, what Microsoft will do, or what the Teams tool will do, is it will start to hide them. So just like you're seeing here, the user has several apps installed, but they start to drop off and pop behind here. So you can pin them versus unpin them, but at some point there's only a certain number you can pin, at which point they're going to fall here. So this is why it's recommended to pre-install Connections app for your user and put it somewhere prominent on the menu, possibly even right at the top, or first or second item, if that makes sense. Remember also there's the mobile experience, and we want to be aware of that from the user's perspective as well. So if you make it the first item, for example, on that menu, then from a mobile experience, it's very prominent and easily accessible to the user.
Thanks, Hilton. Let me see. I'm getting lots of thanks for the training. Great training. Thank you.
That's okay. Great, thank you.
Somebody says, can we have more than one home site?
Excellent question. No, you can only designate one site as your actual home site for the organization. It doesn't have to be the root site. So for instance, we were looking at that as the root site, as the site for our demo. It doesn't have to be the one right at the root, and it's possible to swap over time as well. If you have another site, you can switch it between the root site and so on. There's a site swapping capability, but it doesn't have to be the root site. But you can only have one home site, one primary site that controls all of the home site stuff. Like I showed here, though, there is an option to do some more advanced stuff if it made sense to have another site as your Viva Connection site, but I would suggest you'd have to have a really good reason to do that. You really need to try and stay within the safety bounds. Go with you can only have one home site and use that as your Viva Connection site as well.
Thanks so much, Hilton. On behalf of the ESPC community, thank you so much for taking the time today. It was really great getting lots of good feedback there. So this is the end of the webinar. Please find more about this webinar at sharepointeurope.com, the resource centre. Thanks for joining us today. Take care and goodbye.